Kia ora everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our latest webinar from Aotearoa Property Data Network, the second webinar in our Empowering Data webinar series, the second of 3 webinars in that series. Today we're joined by Urban Intelligence and the Natural Hazards Commission, each with a fantastic presentation for you today. My name is Ben Riley. I'm a Sector Engagement Partner here at Toitū Te Whenua Land Information New Zealand, and I'll be emceeing as is our usual way. So I will just chop through a karakia to kick us off, and then we will get into it. Te mata tātou, whāia te mātauranga, kia marama, kia tūpu, kia tiaki nā whenua, nā moana, nā arawai, kia whaitake nā mahi katoa, aroha atu, aroha mai, tātou ia tātou, toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi tū te whenua, homie, hui, tai kie. So a bit of housekeeping first. You will the camera and microphones today are set so that you can activate them if you wish during the question and answer time that we've got built in. If you do have a question, feel free to at any point when it comes to you, just pop it in the chat so you don't forget what it is, or the Q&A bar at the top, and I can either voice that during the question and answer time after the presentations, or after each presentation, I should say, or you can raise a hand and I'll call you up, and you can turn on your mic and your camera if you'd like to voice it yourself, and have a bit of a chat. So otherwise, the webinar is being recorded, and it'll be shared afterwards with everyone who's registered and otherwise in our mailing list already. So as I said, today we've got 2 presentations. Firstly, from Urban Intelligence, a demonstration of their Resilience Explorer tool, and I have not updated that name. Sorry, Mitchell. A late ring-in from Urban Intelligence. We've got Dr. Mitchell Anderson, the CEO of Urban Intelligence today, sharing that presentation for us. And then Natural Hazards Commission sharing their Natural Hazards portal, and we've got Chris McDowell, the Natural Hazards portal lead. So firstly, to our first presentation, and introducing Dr. Mitchell Anderson properly. He's the co-founder and CEO of Urban Intelligence, a Christchurch-based company that helps people make better decisions for a more resilient future. With a background in civil engineering and a focus on climate risk, Mitchell works with government agencies, iwi, and infrastructure owners to develop tools that make it easier to understand and plan for climate-related challenges. Dr. Mitchell, over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Ben. Confirming you can still hear me loud and clear?
Terrific. Excellent. Just start sharing when you're ready, and I'll disappear until the Q&A.
Excellent. With any luck, people can see the screen, and I'll kick off. So, kia ora koutou, ko Mitchell Anderson Toka Wingwa. I'm the CEO and co-founder of the Urban Intelligence team, partially based down here in Otatahi, Christchurch, but starting to spread out around the motu. Look, the purpose of today's talk is continuing on this Aotearoa Property Data Network Empowering Data webinar series, talking around how our team as Urban Intelligence has been using some of the excellent data sets coming out of LINZ and other areas. Ultimately, this falls into this idea of enabling risk-informed decisions across Aotearoa, New Zealand. A little bit of background. So Urban Intelligence, our mission more or less is to accelerate evidence-based decisions for community resilience. So how we plan and think around natural hazards, climate change, and how that interacts with our communities, our infrastructure networks, our businesses, our systems of systems. So we have a team of 20 plus around the country, mostly engineers, social scientists, risk analysts and advisors, looking to raise the bar on how we, I guess, assess, measure, understand and treat risk within our communities, councils, cities, districts, regions, and so on. I get the pleasure of representing these excellent folk, very smiley folk, very handsome, good-looking people. More specifically, the work that we do, I guess, thinking around it from a national perspective on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis, we make thousands of decisions as a country across our businesses, councils, communities, iwi hapu, etc., that relate to the areas that we work, live, play, etc., and the billions of dollars worth of assets, infrastructure, communities, and processes that fall within that. And so the goal for us is to think around how we can embed spatial risk as that evidence base, as a cornerstone or a foundational piece across all of those decisions. And so whether that's our asset management plans, our infrastructure strategies and investments, and long-term and district plans, specific adaptation planning, insurance, emergency management, making sure that basically risk and resilience and adaptation is not a bolt-on or an ad hoc solution that we're doing, but one that becomes part and parcel of the many decisions that are already being made on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis. Where we work and how this often falls out in action is mostly across our local governments, so supporting councils, regional authorities, infrastructure groups, our lifeline utilities, and businesses and communities to think around how we embed this evidence base of spatial risk as that changes under different hazard types and different timeframes into the decisions, the investments, etc., that we are making. We're fortunate enough to do that right across the Motu, across Asia Pacific, and in parts of EU, but we'll keep the focus for today here in New Zealand. Right, the way that we often do this is through a platform we call the Resilience Explorer, which is how we try once again to raise that bar of how decision makers can engage with and understand risk information as it pertains to their assets, their communities, their functions, etc. Now the Resilience Explorer is just a way of exploring and engaging on that information. Sitting behind that is the actual work that our team does, sitting in this risk and resilience engine, or the what if or the so what engine, so to speak. What would a future of 1 metre sea level rise look like for our coastal communities? What would our residual risk look like if we made these decisions across the next 2 decades to reduce that? But I guess the work that we do is fundamentally underpinned by, as much as we can find, really good quality, high resolution data, which of course is the thread and the link back to today's conversation around how we've been using and interacting with some of the LINS property pilot information or building title, etc. data sets. So again, we can't do the work that we do without access to this really high quality and high resolution information, and we're very fortunate for that. So I guess from a today perspective, the property pilot data sets, or I guess the parcel information as that then relates to our DVR data sets, address points, titles, building outlines, census information, social deprivation, our business activities, etc. This property pilot or this parcel information really becomes a core foundational or a backbone to the work that we do, that then links into many of the other great pieces of work that's happening around the country. And so when we're thinking around physical or spatial risk management, we try and do this wherever possible from a ground up approach. So understanding what is likely to happen at my home, your home, my assets, my roads that I'm managing, pumps, pipes, etc., rather than abstracting things at a suburb or otherwise level, which has its merits depending on the decisions or priorities we're trying to set. But when it comes down to brass tacks and we're making decisions around physical risk in certain places, we need to know where, who, and what is at risk from what. And so ultimately this happens at a asset and or a parcel level or a building level. And so starting with that where, who and what might be impacted by what hazards. Ultimately, from a property level, this falls out into the changing Lagoima Act at the moment, so changing land information memorandums, different consenting processes, asset planning and interventions, and of course, adaptation investment. And so I'm going to run through a couple of case studies, or at least a few examples of how the LINS information that we've been able to use as that kind of data backbone at that parcel and property level has improved some of the risk estimates that we've been able to work with alongside many a council infrastructure provider across Aotearoa. And so there's 5 threads that I want to pull on before wrapping it up around basically how this data has enabled us to do better damage estimates, more granular financial losses, improve community resilience metrics, enhanced distributional justice, and stronger community engagement or community education around natural hazard risk and resilience, not just for present day risk, but how that progresses and changes in future. So look, the first one for us, and a bit of a snippet out of the tool, is when we think around trying to understand our risk, or I guess coming back to the saying, you can't build a house without a plan or a blueprint, and we can't build resilience without understanding our risk. And so when we're going through this risk analysis, the first process is identifying the different hazard scenarios, their extents and intensities. What we'll then do is identify whether the things that we value and care about, and they may be our roads, property parcels, buildings, businesses, etc., whether they interact with that hazard extent at all, and that's what we call exposure. But of course, we know that different buildings, different facilities, different assets react very differently to the same level of wind loading, inundation depth, flood velocities, for example. And so linking back to things like this property pilot data set, which then pulls through things like the DVR data set where appropriate, gives us really good access to granular information around the building or the property characteristics or attributes that make it more or less susceptible to damage, disruption, or other sets of losses under that interaction with a particular event. And so what we're showing on the screen here is saying that we can go from not just understanding the 3% of buildings that may be exposed to a particular flood extent, but also breaking that down by the estimated damage or the particular cost that we might see in terms of how those properties were built, their conditions, their age, the foundation type, finish levels, etc. All those things that change how those properties may react under certain conditions. One of the other things that makes it really interesting, again, building on this access to really high quality information, is not just understanding the particular damage distribution or exposures across our property portfolio, but also understanding the value that is at risk or may be at risk under these events. And so connecting to things like the DVR data set, which links back to our parcels and titles, identifying where we may have improvement values or land values that become at risk for some level of value. One of the more interesting things we can do outside of that is linking to some of the Stats NZ data around employment and economic activity by sector, where we can start to identify for particular land parcels and facilities or particular communities where there is certain economic sector activity, identifying where you may have certain regional economic disruption. So let's say you've got an area that is heavily dependent on, let's say, a mining area within a particular part of a district, or it might be on the screen, retail trade, for example. Identifying how these different businesses and sectors may respond or be disrupted, and at what scales and for what time periods, and what this means in terms of different decisions we may make, or business cases that a certain council or community may make to intervene within that system before that risk becomes realised. Again, having access to this really high resolution building and parcel level means we can start to connect to some of our lifeline infrastructure networks to identify where we have key facilities, whether they be medical centres, hospitals, homes, businesses, marae, that may be high and dry in a flood, but because of the way they're connected to our inherently interdependent infrastructure networks, may lose access to power, water, wastewater, their supply chains, evacuation routes, or other critical services along that period. And again, we cannot do this without having good access to this building or property level, as well as the network level information. One of the other really interesting things is there's a good quote, I think, disasters don't discriminate, but the way that we plan and respond to them often does. And so making sure that we can put equity or distributional justice at the forefront, or communities at the forefront of our decisions, becomes really important. Now, using things like a synthetic population layer, understanding where people live or where we have certain buildings or land parcels classed as residential, gives us a much better insight into what the different subgroups, socioeconomic classes or otherwise, live within these areas, and may or may not be impacted in different ways by the events that we are simulating or expecting to see. And that, of course, means that when we're going to intervene or engage with a particular community, we already have a good idea of what challenges this particular group or subgroup is likely to see, and making sure that when we do intervene or make some changes or risk reduction strategies, that it's doing so in a way that is equitable and fair, rather than assuming one population across that entire area. And then the last one I want to talk around before pulling back to a slightly wider level is at this property level reporting. And so many of you will be aware of the Goima Act changes coming through at the moment, effective very soon, and how that pertains to, I guess, more effective natural hazard communication on land information memorandums. And so again, without identifying the particular titles or the particular building outlines, we can't produce anywhere near the level of information that we have on the screen here that identifies when and how different hazards may interact with different properties, parcels, and other assets. Pulling back to a slightly higher level in terms of what some of this data has enabled us to do in past is at a national level, working with the Climate Change Commission last year, looking at a national exposure assessment of our residential properties and other critical infrastructure. And so this is where we looked at a home by home level assessment for direct exposure to coastal flooding, but also where we have these homes and parcels and address points that are likely to become either temporarily or permanently cut off from certain services, whether that's areas of education, healthcare, emergency services, or employment. You can find the report online. I'm happy to share a link after this. This was published last year, but in terms of the process, we get to simulate these different events, identify where we have these direct impacts, but then identify some of these cascades around where we have certain communities or particularly households and land parcels that are likely to become cut off. And so I'll let that loop through once more. What we find at a national level is these kind of indirect risks, using isolation as but one example of many here, often far supersedes or trumps by orders of magnitude the number of homes, the number of population that we expect to be directly impacted. And so again, when we go to think around the types of interventions, the level of resource that we need as districts, regions, or as a country to adapt to some of these changing events, this helps to widen the scope or better understand the risk profile that we face. To round this out, I think coming back to this idea that our decisions are only as good as the data informing them, which is very much the case in the work that we do. This is a really nice opportunity for me and our team to say thanks to LINZ for the awesome work that they do, and of course thanks to all of you for taking time on your Wednesday to listen to me go through this. Happy to answer any questions. Otherwise, Ben, shall I pass it back to you?
Hi, Mitchell. That was a brilliant little presentation there. Thank you. There are some questions in the chat and the Q&A. I've got a couple myself just from watching. I'll chop to Rachel has asked, are all government agencies that manage public infrastructure all proactively using these analysis services, specifically the Ministry of Education, which is partially responsible for the school property portfolio? I'm curious to know if they are currently utilising this information. You might not be able to. There might be a limit to what you can share, but yeah, can you give us an idea?
Yeah, well, I think it's from a New Zealand perspective, this is a maturity curve that everyone is going through at the moment in terms of better identifying and understanding their risk. I think for a long time we've been in an era where risk transfer or insurance has been the default, which largely means we don't have to think around the specific risk that we may see in some cases. What we're starting to see now, where there is the impact of insurance retreat impacting certain properties, portfolios and businesses, is that self-insurance or self-understanding of risk is becoming a massive priority. So I guess to Rachel's question, it's a moving target at the moment. Some councils and some businesses, some groups are doing this better than others, but everyone is kind of moving along that curve at similar rates or similar trajectories. MOE, for example, I understand has done a one-off piece of work a couple of years ago in terms of identifying the initial exposure across their portfolio, if I'm not mistaken, but I'm not sure what's been done since then.
Right, thank you. You mentioned building. Yeah, it might have been a misphrase, but you mentioned building title extraction from Lynn. So we have property titles, but building information might be a slightly different thing. And so I guess the thrust of the question is where are you getting your building information? And
Yeah, well, I guess,
is it spatialized?
Yeah, I think Ben, I'm sure you'll be familiar with this as well, but I guess through the, at least as far as I understand it at the moment, the property pilot dataset that we're working with has these beautiful association tables, which means we can link back the property datasets with titles and properties and then buildings, which through DVR means we can access things like the different materials and so forth, which enables some of the work that we do. So hopefully, Rebecca, that answers your question.
Right, yes, and I can expand on that. So we have, Lens has published what's called the New Zealand or NZ Property Hybrid, brackets pilot layer. It's derived from DVR, and there is access, if you're, especially if you're working for government agencies, able to access that layer and other DVR data that we publish, then it's really helpful and does have all those reference tables, as you said, Mitchell. So yeah, good to see that that's a relatively new layer and something that's still a bit of a work in progress, but already being really useful. Next question, is AI a game changer for your analytical capabilities? Yeah, you didn't mention AI in the presentation, but yeah, how much of it are you using? Are you jumping right in? Are you sort of dipping a toe? How's it changing the game for you?
Yeah, I think like many businesses and teams thinking about it in a number of different ways. There's the classic kind of organizational support. So, help me write an email, those kind of things. Put together a slide pack for this upcoming Lynn's presentation, for example. But I guess Doug's question is around those analytical capabilities. The short answer is no, and that's because all of the models we use here are largely network and physical based rather than predictive. Anyone who's trying to tell you they have a predictive model for where the next earthquake is going to happen or otherwise raise an eyebrow at them. I think where it has been useful in past is for data quality issues. And so there's an example that we used possibly 2 years ago where pulling together different machine learning and predictive models to backfill different data sets or attributes across things like, let's take a residential property layer with different finish levels, so identifying how a flood may impact a portfolio of homes. At the time, we didn't have full coverage of a certain area for having those attributes, but based on their age, condition, area, district plan at the time, building code at the time, we could start to build on a few rules and algorithms that backfilled that. So I guess AI game changer for analytical capabilities. Wouldn't use the word game changer yet, but there's definitely some interesting stuff happening in the field.
Interesting. Nice. Have you had any traction with regional CDEM teams to identify locations of risk, etc.? And is that sort of through local government contracts or directly? How are you working with them?
Yeah, well, kia ora, Shannon, thanks for the question. The short answer is a little bit. Most of the work that we've been doing has been focused around this long-term infrastructure and community adaptation planning, so often working through asset managers and I guess adaptation teams within local government. That said, there's been a few examples like the Canterbury Lifelines assessment, and now a couple of local authorities across, or councils across New Zealand, where they've picked up the Resilience Explorer and starting to use it as for desktop assessments, or I guess that readiness and risk reduction step rather than the response or recovery, thinking about those 4 hours. So the short answer, Shannon, would be there's more opportunities there for these kind of risk tools to be used in a CDM space, but yet to be seen.
Nice. Yeah, I was struck by your comment about how disasters don't discriminate, and when thinking a bit back to disaster risk reduction professor at uni, he put it a bit more bluntly that there's no such thing as a natural disaster. Natural events happen and disasters are man-made, and that was speaking to the preparedness or lack thereof of a society. So and you showed up as an example of those hill communities who would have indirect impacts from an event. And do you get involved, or do you sort of give advice in terms of the planning for those hill-based residential communities as well? And it might not be sort of a more direct risk reduction, but more sort of indirect, planning for having supplies or new access on hand that will not be going down the coast road or what have you. Yeah, do you give advice on that, or is that sort of where your work cuts off and the council sort of takes over?
Where we get the opportunity to, but I guess the remit that we try and fill is to enable and empower particular council staff and CDM staff or otherwise who know their communities, know their staff, know their business far better than we ever will. So making sure they have the right information to communicate that. But yes, where appropriate, we'll certainly give advice around. In fact, there was some interesting work with the Wellington Regional Emergency Management Office a couple of years ago, looking at planned emergency levels of service and identifying at a household level. Let's say you had a Wellington fault rupture, how long would particular homes or parts of communities have to go without access to food or running water? How long are they using the bucket in the backyard? Those kind of things. So yes, certainly something that we're thinking about and at least trying to support others to do.
Awesome. And Peter Inwards jumped in with a bit of as we'd hope, a property data technical question. So you referred in your presentation to DVR, the valuation reference, titles and parcels, but which one are you using primarily for your definition of property?
Good question, and one that I would typically pass to one of our data engineers. But look, as far as I understand it, I think we've got Jared on the call, so he can jump in too if I get this wrong. But defining property as that kind of unique legal boundary where you've got titles that stack on top of that, so the property becomes your spatial area. Again, Ben, tell me if you guys define this slightly differently. This would be a good time to work that out.
Well, I mean, if you're using our hybrid layer, it is a combination of the purpose of that layer is to give a sort of the most accurate available sort of fullest boundary extent of properties. So that is based. It sort of uses DVR as the key to reference then to titles and parcels, and because you can have sort of multiple titles and parcels in a valuation sort of property. So, and then we identify them with once we've matched them up, we assign them a unique ID again to create a unit of property. So from Lens's point of view, we're certainly sort of using DVR as the lead. And because a lot of that, the use case for that is feeding back into councils, who obviously have the valuation references as their, primary definition of property. But yeah, so that's, I suspect it's probably along the similar lines, if that's what you're using for your data as well. I hope, Peter, that was a good answer for you. And I think just one more before we move to our second presentation. So Rebecca has just followed up. She was referring specifically to Section 72 hazard notices in the Building Act. So this was that earlier question around building information. And are those hazard notices being displayed spatially in the Resilience Explorer?
Not at this stage, but it's something
Right.
that we've talked around internally that we'd like to be doing, and there's certainly no reason why we shouldn't. There's been one example where we've had a council go through and backfill some of their building notices based on new hazard information that's come through in Rex or the Resilience Explorer, but that's only happened once in this case that I'm aware of.
Sweet. Okay, well, thanks again, Dr. Mitchell, for your presentation and answering questions so fantastically today. We will move to our second presentation now. I'll just share my screen again and introduce our next presenter properly. Sorry, bear with me.
Awesome. Thanks, Ben, and kia ora. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Mitchell. Right. So next we have Chris McDowell from Natural Hazards Commission, and he is the Natural Hazards Portal lead in the risk reduction team at the Commission. He's a geographer by training. Chris has spent his career working with maps and spatial data in roles at Manaaki Whenua, the National Library of New Zealand, the New Zealand Herald, and with Health New Zealand Te Whatu Ora. He is the co-author of We Are Here, an Atlas of Aotearoa. We've got a copy of it in our reception area at Lynn's, and Exploration of New Zealand through Maps and Data. His work blends science, storytelling, and technology to help people better understand the landscapes they live in. Hi, Chris. Whenever you're ready, you can start presenting.
Sure, thanks, Ben. All right, I will switch over to another presentation. How's that look? Let's start the slideshow. Great. Kia ora koutou, ko Chris McDowell talking. I've had a funny old career, but there's almost always been maps involved somewhere in it. I joined the Natural Hazards Commission in October of 2024 and took a role in a project that was already live, the Natural Hazards Portal, an existing product that had launched in mid-2023. I'm going to speak to you a lot about that, how that came about, how important property data is to it. It's absolutely fundamental, and sort of show you what was created. And then towards the end, we're actually moving into phase 2 of the project, and I'll just show you a little bit of that work which is really what the main focus of what I do is the second phase of the Natural Hazards Portal. So why this work matters? It's really important. We have, I think, as you all know, and as Mitchell laid out in his a resilience challenge in this country. It's high exposure to natural hazard risks. We've got built assets that are vulnerable to damage by natural hazards, and they can result in significant costs. We've got legacy planning issues, which means that some of our communities are in high-risk locations for hazards. Natural hazard events have long and ongoing impacts on well-being. These are not entirely solved by insurance, and a small economy cannot sustain the financial and social costs of ongoing hazard events. So somehow we've got to do better. I'm going to talk to you a little bit in dollar terms today. the Natural Hazards Commission, many of you may actually know it from its previous incarnation. It changed in the middle of last year. So it was previously EQC, the Earthquake Commission, and there was a change to the Act that governs the Commission, and consequently a change in the name. The change in the Act and in the name is to recognise that it's more than just about earthquakes. There's actually a set of different types of natural hazards that the Commission engages with and provides insurance cover for. Those include, of course, earthquakes, but it's also storms and flood, landslides, volcanic activity, tsunami, and geothermal. There's also the climate change is recognised as an exacerbating factor for many of those. So what I'm showing you there is the annualized cost, though, based on a 50-year probabilistic loss model. So this is the theoretical amount that you need to put away as a country in order to pay for natural hazards over that time span. So it's about 1.2 billion. That's at the national level. It's for all hazards and all assets, so not just residential, but it's just the direct costs. If you add on indirect costs, intangible costs, explicit costs, then that figure is likely to double or even triple based on different pieces of research that have been done over the years. And all the time we're adding to it. I'm just going to show you a few things, but one of the primary data sets that we work with at the Natural Hazards Commission is the claims themselves, and they're claims at the level of individual homeowners and properties, residential properties, that is. We see far too many properties moving rapidly from construction to an insurance claim. So I think this is in Auckland. It was constructed on a cliff top in 2018, 2019. Its first insurance payout was 2020. We're looking at the Taieri Plains. This was constructed in 2016. Its first insurance payout was 2017. I could keep on doing this for the rest of the talk. This is going to be the last one I'm going to show you. This is just in Awatoto, southern Napier coastal settlement. What you're seeing on the left there is what the suburb looked like in 2012. In 2022, you can see that there's been quite a lot of expansion in terms of the residential housing and more being built. What we're looking at, though, on the right there is the 2016 Hawke's Bay flood hazard maps, and then updated just a little in 2021. And February 2023, Cyclone Gabriel came through. These are just two photographs. The areas that the council maps indicated would flood did indeed flood. This is predictable. The hazard maps that exist within councils are not perfect, but they are very, very good indicators of what is likely to come and what is likely to happen. So what we're doing here within the Natural Hazards Commission is, for the first time a couple of years ago, we actually created a public-facing website to share the data about how different residential properties have been affected by claims historically. And the goal is to make natural hazard risk information more easily accessible to all New Zealanders. We're trying to address the imbalance of information between organisations and the public. Organisations hold a great deal of this information. Sometimes they try and open it up, other times it's not necessarily within their interest to do so. But we are trying to, especially work with some of our partners in council, and I'll show this in the last part of the talk, but to try and take what is a fragmented and inconsistent landscape of data and bring it together in a public education website. Specifically, we want to provide people with the information that they need to make risk-informed choices about property and land. Why is this important? It's important. I've got this crazy thing on my Teams where everything jumps in front of the text I'm trying to read. So excuse me, but it's important because we want to be clear and transparent in sharing hazard risk information, because that leads to early risk reduction interventions. So we are not working on a response website. This is for resilience and readiness and recovery. In fact, when there is any kind of event, the very first thing that we do is stick up a banner across the Natural Hazards portal, which I'll show you in a moment, which says, please do not use this site, go to, and we direct to the appropriate emergency response agency. So phase 1 of the Natural Hazards portal. This is something that launched in mid-2023, so it predates me. It's been something that's been on the minds of people here, though, for quite some time. Phase 1 was to build an online, standalone, free-to-access natural hazard risk education website. Phase 1 has some basic geospatial functionality. It allows people to access previous Toka, EQC, or Natural Hazard Commission settled claims information at property level, and to a limited degree also at aggregate levels. And that's going all the way back to 1997. What that basically means is if you are a homeowner, or you're a renter, or you are looking to purchase a home, the offering's very simple. You can look up that address and you can see the history of settled claims at that property location. So, which is basically that there. We had always actually, well, since the OIA existed, the Commission had always made that data available via an OIA request. This is just a way of shortcutting that, opening it up so the public can come in and search. The portal shows the address of the claim or claims, the type of claims, the event date, the event type. We went through a lot of privacy assessment processes to make this possible. It's quite amazing reading reading back through those documents and the amount of diligence that was done. And users can also request more detailed information through a claims information request. I want to just I'll show, and then for the rest of the thing, I'll sort of look at data and the portal itself. But I do just want to make a point, which is a point that we really try and stress within the messaging on the website, and especially if somebody finds that there is a claim on a home. Claims are not a bad thing. They're a sign that something's happened to a property in the past. This could be significant, or it could be relatively minor. It could be that it was a crack in the wall and that needed to be repaired after an earthquake, or it could be something much more significant. So if you are buying a property, many of you, I imagine, on this call maybe, and at some time in the near future, that has had a claim on it, you may wish to ask more about questions just to understand what happened and how it was fixed. So a claim doesn't mean you have to avoid a property. We can't avoid all risks. There are many actions, though, that we can take to understand and manage our risks. And that is what this Natural Hazard Portal is about, to know your risk and make risk-informed decisions. So this is the portal as it stands today. As I said before, we're currently actually in it's slightly awkward timing for this talk. We're actually in the midst of procurement and design for the second phase of the portal, which I'll speak a little bit about at the end. But because of the sensitivity of that process, there's certain things I can't say about the second phase, but I'll say whatever I can. But this is the portal as it looks today in phase 1. It's a big map. It's a big map with cluster markers on it, and those clusters show the number of claims. So we're looking here at 370,000 or 360,000 claims across the country, very heavily focused in Te Waipounamu, South Island, and 41,000 claims in the North Island. Very happy to talk about cluster markers. It's actually in cartography later on, but I won't speak to it now, apart from to say I'm not a huge fan of cluster markers, but I think that they work okay here. Zoom in or search for an address, and again, we see claims at the level of the suburbs. In the next phase, we'll actually be doing quite a bit with the in terms of the visualization of these claims. But for now, it sort of just gives you a sense. We're looking at Central Wellington and how many claims have occurred. And if you zoom right down into the property level, then you can see individual claims on specific residential properties. The property data as it stands today on the Natural Hazards Portal is CoreLogic Master Map. One of the things that we are doing at the moment, in fact, straight after this, I'll be heading into a session on it, is we've actually been for future incarnations of the portal looking at the hybrid NZ property hybrid, and specifically the NZ property spine and the use of a unit of property ID as the fundamental identifier. But this is all just exploratory work at the moment. For the moment, this is the CoreLogic data. And when we click on any address, there are a series of pop-ups that provide more information about the specifics of that place and the history of claims on that property. So that is the address for the Natural Hazards Portal, www.naturalhazardsportal.gov.nz. And I'm just going to speak a little bit about our future plans. And again, I apologise, I am limited in what, by government probity rules, by what I can say here. But what I definitely can say is that the phase 2 goal is to improve community resilience through access to natural hazard information. And I'm so excited about how we're doing this. Phase 2 expands the portal by providing access to natural hazard maps, starting with a Bay of Region pilot. So these maps are not to the level of sophistication of what we saw with urban intelligence. It's very much just trying to collate and integrate information from many different district councils, city councils, regional councils, and also what are currently Crown Research Institutes, soon to be the PROs, and bring that data into a single place and then be able to direct people to those home institutions where they can learn more. Again, it's a public education website rather than something which is for doing deep analysis. So we're working on the Bay of Plenty. This is the Bay Hazards Viewer, which is run by the Bay of Plenty Regional Council. It's a great resource for people who live in the area. You can explore landslides, liquefaction, volcanics, active faults, tsunami. And this is one of many sources that we're bringing together. We're building ETL pipelines to consume the data, merge it, and then produce reconciled natural hazard maps, all in the same frame that people can explore. This is not at all what it will look like. This is actually just a little internal tool that we've been building, but it's one that just pulls in all of the data, stitches it together, and then represents it in the original classifications of the source agency. The next step of what we're doing is to then make overview statements at the level of property, and then to surface those through a rebuilt version of the Natural Hazards Portal, which we expect to launch in early 2026. One thing I will just note, and it's an amazing challenge, it's especially acute for flooding and landslides, but to a lesser extent with some other natural hazards, is the different ways in which different territorial authorities and regional authorities report on the data and present it. So, for example, in the Western Bay of Plenty, stormwater flood maps are typically shared in terms of the floodable area. For Rotorua, they've actually got several different ways that they do it, but it's one of the most common is by 1 in 100 year flood depth, so 1% annual exceedance probability, and we're looking at different flood levels. And Tauranga uses similar classifications for depths, but they also show the overland flows and the floodplains. This one, we're actually looking at a climate change scenario here, but they've got similar maps for predicted current day risk. And what we're trying to do at the moment is to stitch all of these together, expressing them in the classifications and terms of the source agency, but then also make statements at the level of property. And unfortunately, I can't show you that work just yet, but it'll be something that later in the year, if people are interested, we could absolutely share, and we would love to get your feedback on. So that's a really, really quick overview. if you're interested in learning more, please get in touch. We are at the stage where we've been doing user research for the last few months. I've been driving around to councils in the Bay of Plenty all of last week, and we've been engaging with them a lot over the course of the year. And we are just really keen to talk to people and make sure that we build the right thing. So thank you very much for your time. And I will hand it back over to Ben.
Hello again. Thank you, Chris. That was excellent, and yeah, a super exciting sneak peek at the phase 2 of the Natural Hazards portal, and phase 1 is already doing such a valuable task of making that information available for people. To start with, I guess I'm struck by the sort of way you started, was that, you know, the hazards, the risks are known, and yet things seem to be increasingly being built in harm's way. Why? You know, why? What do you observe? Because I know Natural Hazards Commission sort of gives advice to councils in their planning stages, and those councils are probably creating plans that avoid risk as much as possible. But
yes,
we're still building in. Things are still getting built in harm's way. So what's your observation of why that is?
Yeah, so I'm not quite so close to this as other members of my team. So I sit within the risk reduction team within resilience, and many of my colleagues work on council submissions. And I feel like I do need to be slightly careful in my appraisal that I don't shoot from the hip. But I think it's fair to say that there's tremendous variability across the country, and we're a relatively small nation, but we have 67 different territorial authorities, and then the regionals on top of them. And within those organizations, there's different kind of arrangements of people. And my observation is that different councils are at different places when it comes to thinking about risk, and part of that is to do with availability of the data, in that sometimes, so the level of hazard mapping is actually quite different across the country for certain hazards, flooding in particular. But also there is variation in the amount that people might raise risks about them. Sometimes you might even not quite know that the risk exists. But I think I should probably stop talking because it's not quite my area. I just know that variation does exist. Yeah.
Fair enough. You took a good diplomatic shot at it.
I keep feeling myself saying things that were going to get me into trouble.
Fair enough. So there's a few questions in the Q&A, and it's all about phase 2.
Sure.
Everyone's excited
I will
about
answer
the
whatever
next
I can.
thing. Yeah, of course. So the phase 2 pilot with Bay of Plenty, is that being built with the intention of satisfying imminent Lim Lagoyama changes, plus the regulations on natural hazard information? Is the phase 2 being built with those new regulatory structures in mind?
Phase 2 is being built for public education. So this is not something that's really sort of geared up for is to be an official information resource. This is not a one-stop shop. This is, well, we hope, a first stop on many people's journey to learning about natural hazards, but we're successful if we've got people to the source agencies. So this is not something which I think should even be, we're not creating new information. We are collating information that already exists, bringing it together, but really importantly, pointing it to the source and back to the authority. So this is not even something that I would expect to see referenced on a limb, for example, because we're not creating new information, we're not deriving information. This is something that is there to educate and then to help people find their way to learn more.
Which is so important, right? I mean, one thing we know about the property market is that there's a lot of information scattered in a lot of different places, and it's
absolutely
never mind. We've already spoken about sort of council planning, but then for Joe Bloggs trying to buy a house and understand what he's buying or they're buying, it's a it's a hard ask, right?
One of the wake-up calls I
to be
had,
fully informed.
Yeah, it was like I visited some people who in Wellington had recently purchased a home, and they had created a spreadsheet which had 12 different websites that they were visiting when they got serious about making an offer on a home. And the closer I looked, the more it was like, oh my goodness, yes, you do kind of need each of these pieces of information if you really want to be informed. I'm not sure that we would hit all of them, but I think we were looking at hitting about 7 or 8 of them, and bringing those together.
Yeah, I saw someone do a similar thing. I wonder if it was the same person. Anyway, and yeah, it was astounding how much into detail that spreadsheet was getting for the person that I saw do it anyway. So, hi Chris, what is the time frame for phase 2? So you mentioned early 2026.
Great.
Is that just the Bay of Plenty pilot? Is that?
That's correct. Yeah. So our timelines, as I say, we're in a procurement process at the moment, and we expect to have our development partner in around about September. And but we're doing a lot of the data work we've been doing it for quite some time, and we will continue. And we expect that it will be around about Easter of next year, launching with a pilot, and then expanding it out from there to other regions. That's a matter of bringing the data on board rather than building new tech for these other regions. The tech should service the whole of the country.
Awesome.
But yeah, let's say next Easter.
Yeah, no, that's super exciting from what you've shown us today. Hi, Chris. I know you mentioned the variance in hazard data, but will there be consideration of the suitability or quality of hazard information that you show within the portal?
Yeah, this is such an important question. We've been doing user research testing, and it's one of the things that keeps coming up, especially from a more informed user, is a desire to really understand the context of the information as it's presented. So that's something, so to understand context, to understand various kind of measures of accuracy and reliability. We are working to try and figure out how to present this on the application. And one thing I can say is that the approach that we're taking is almost what you saw before was a big interactive map, which in phase 1, or what you'd see if you went to the Natural Hazards portal today, and you click on the map or search for an address, and it gives you a pop-up, and then another pop-up, and then another pop-up. It quickly became clear, I think, at least in my working with that model almost needs to be folded inside out. And so instead of a big map with many pop-ups, the approach that we're taking is that each residential property in the country will have its own page with a map as one element of that, but then space below to provide the appropriate context to the information that's being presented. Yeah. The map is important, but the map is not the only thing. And that map can always be full screened if you really want to see that.
Yeah, no, that seems to be the way a few different spatial platforms, web apps are going. It's having the sort of the map and the data side by side for context and the detail as well. Yeah, no, that's exciting. Dr. Mitchell's just popped in with I think this might be our last question. Will the phase 2 natural hazard layer viewer keep up to date as new layers become available? What is the process for this, and is this the intention?
The intention is absolutely to do that. We're working that through with the councils at the moment, but what we're looking at is about a monthly cadence of updates, which is not to say that we expect monthly updates, but once, as like all of the different councils start coming online and CRIs start coming online, those councils who participate, then we would look for a monthly cadence of updates. And that goes with property data and claims data too. It's what we currently do actually with property data and claims data, is that in the final week of each month, that's when we do our update. Right.
Okay. Awesome. And this is such a good question that I'll include it, but it will be definitely the last question because we're hard against time. So what is the Commission's sharing learnings of standardization, quality of natural hazard data? Is it just flooding and natural and landslides currently? What other data is there? How good is it? Be keen to connect so this is Rebecca, would be keen to connect on the landslide data as we're working on a GIS standard for the open landslide database.
Would love to. There's all sorts of. This is a. Oh my goodness! I can't believe this is the last question because this is a huge question. Please email me, Rebecca. There's all sorts of work that's happening, not just in the commission, but also with other parts of government, MFE and elsewhere around this. It was the visiting. Who did I visit last week? I was with Tauranga City, Bay of Plenty Regional, Opotiki District, and Rotorua District. Unprompted, every single council raised standardisation, especially for floods and landslides, looking for a national standard. It's a overdue and it's a hot topic. We need it.
Yeah. Does that tie into spatial planning standardisation as a broader?
I expect it does.
Standardisation topic? Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, that's good. Yeah, it's interesting to hear that that's your experience from all the councils that you've visited so far.
And our own
I'm sure it'll be the
experience
same
with
elsewhere.
Yeah. Other hazards tend to be actually easier to deal with, even though liquefaction is sort of different. There is a sort of de facto standard. Faults are kind of centrally managed. Active fault zones, there's a standard. Tsunami, there's a emerging standard, but yeah, floods are really challenging.
Okay. Well, I'm going to call time on that question and answer. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation and for answering those questions so well. And thanks again to Dr. Mitchell as well from Urban Intelligence. Likewise for your presentation and answering questions. If either of you, so Chris, Dr. Mitchell, if either of you are happy to pop your email address in the chat for people to get in touch, just do so while I close up. Otherwise, yeah, I'll just I'll close things up with just next slide. Thank you. So just stay tuned. We've got, so the final webinar in our series is in 2 weeks' time at midday on the Wednesday the 18th, with 2 presentations again. First up will be a joint collaboration between Toka Te Whenua and Bay of Plenty Regional Council, talking again to that New Zealand property hybrid layer that you've already heard a little bit about today. And also a presentation from Prism Earth Limited on work that they're doing in the ag sector to help property managers there with location intelligence on all sorts of things. And I will just pop into the chat the link to register for that. Bear with me. And those email addresses are there if you want to contact Chris or Dr. Mitchell. And otherwise, I will just close with the closing karakia. Tamata tātou, kua e te kaupapa. Ka rea nā hua, ka rere nā arawai. Kua mau te maturanga, he arahina nā mahi o Toitu Te Whenua. Kia tau te rangimari e, ki runga I a tātou katoa. Humi e, hui e, tā ki e. Thank you everyone for joining us today and sticking with us past the hour. Have a pleasant rest of your day.